Hi, good morning, everyone. Nick Murray with the Canadian Press. My question is for Minister Joly. The policy talks about promoting infrastructure investment in the north, but doesn't actually make any firm commitments towards funding any infrastructure projects. We heard Minister Blair today talk about the importance of nation building, but even on the defense side of things, it doesn't talk about infrastructure that every northerner can see in the day-to-day lives, like water infrastructure, sewer infrastructure, those kind of projects. And so I'm wondering why the Arctic policy didn't provide any of those funding commitments with regards to nation building in the north as far as infrastructure goes, particularly when we look at how much money Canada sends abroad to help other nations in their nation building. So I'm just wondering why GAC potentially couldn't tap into those pools of money to help build up the north here at home.
So this foreign policy is actually supported by the new Arctic and Northern policy framework that was developed in 2019 and was co-developed by many indigenous communities. And so in 2019, that work, which is actually supported by Dan, the Minister of Northern Affairs, was done, and millions of dollars were committed. And so as part of this Arctic and Northern policy framework, there was an international chapter. That was before Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. And so what we did was to update that chapter, and to make sure ultimately that it would be in line with what we're seeing now and geopolitical tensions that have risen. What we heard also is that the Arctic and Northern policy framework, when it came to infrastructure, was good but could be better. We heard it from everybody. And what we've seen in the past is the Arctic has been developed mainly through two reasons. First one is the investment of defense, military, and second was economic development, particularly natural resources. And so that's why the Minister of Defense is saying now that infrastructure investments are important, because it's the biggest reinvestment in our military in generations, but also it is about infrastructure money. And so here today, we're announcing an Arctic foreign policy. That is our vision. That is also about investing in what diplomats will be doing and supporting also indigenous communities doing that foreign policy. But we well know that the money and the infrastructure money in particular will be either through the Arctic and Northern policy framework or also in the defense policy update that was announced. So maybe you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, just that over the last several years, we've invested hundreds of millions of dollars in infrastructure and housing in the north, and there's been progress. The projects are good, but there's more work to do. The gaps have been so large from generations of underinvestment in the north. So I think we have improvements to do. We think with this accelerated focus and attention to the north, with the foreign policy and with the Arctic defense policy, who have as a principle co-development and dual-use infrastructure, that there's going to be more emphasis. We know there's a lot more work to do. All you have to do is talk to the premiers. They'll tell you in greater detail than I on what we have to do. But we're going to use existing departments with a renewed focus on the Arctic and the north.
And just as a follow-up, and I'm not sure, I wanted to ask this Mr. Blair, but I understand he has house duty. But if, with regards to defense spending for infrastructure projects, I hear what you're saying about the dual use. Mr. Blair had mentioned the airport runway improvements and the support hubs or command hubs. But why not invest in projects that Northerners can see day-to-day from a defense budget side of things? Again, like even on the airport side of things, a lot of airports in the north lack infrastructure with regards to be able to land in bad weather. So why not focus on projects like that where Northerners can see direct impacts on the day-to-day? And as a quick little tidbit, would that also count towards Canada's defense funding to hit its NATO 2% target?
Okay. So, of course, I'll put the caveat that the Minister of Defense can provide more specifics on your question. But the defense policy update was announced back in spring. We decided to make sure that ultimately we had the biggest budget in Canada's recent history. Lots of money, but at the same time, what was important is how we invest that money. And we said, for the first time in decades, that we would be investing it here at home and in the Arctic. Now, the Minister of Defense is working now on how to invest that money. billions of dollars. And like mentioned, he won't do it by himself, or the Department of National Defense won't do it by itself. The investments will be made working with indigenous people to make sure ultimately that indeed it is going to support Canada's defense, but also fundamentally help people living in the North. And so there's still a lot of work to be done. He's doing that work. And also we heard through the defense policy update that there needed to be more work done with indigenous communities to make sure that they would be very much how can I say, at the core of what we were doing. So that's why this Arctic foreign policy took a bit more time. You know, I had many conversations with Nathan about that, but we needed to make sure that while the defense policy update had been announced, we needed to have the Arctic foreign policy, which is basically the vision of what we will do as a country in the world, much more aligned with what were people in the North saying to us. Does that make sense?
It does.
Okay, thanks.
I'd like to add to that if I may.
Yeah, go, PJ.
Yeah.
For my follow-up, I was wondering if the government views this policy as a means to accelerate toward its goal of meeting 2% for NATO.
Yes, we know we have to do more, and we're doing more. So that's why we came up with the defense policy update. And we have massive investments in defense. But that's why also we thought it was important for the world to understand how much, when we're saying in the defense policy update that the Arctic is at the core of our engagement, that actually we have a foreign policy that is supporting it. And that foreign policy is not only coming from diplomats in Ottawa, it has been co-developed with people that live in the North. And I'm proud to say we're the first Arctic country to do that like that. And I think it's a model. I think we can be extremely progressive and make sure that we are people's first when looking at the North. I think also we have to be extremely pragmatic when understanding the geopolitics of what's going on and ultimately making sure that we invest more in defense. I've said it to the media many times, but I'm very hawkish on defense. I really think we need to invest more because as foreign minister, I really see the geopolitical tensions rising. And so that's why I thought it was my job to explain what are the dynamics that we're seeing playing in front of us in the Arctic to make sure that Canadians are aware and understand where we're heading in terms of our defense policy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Ian Austin from the New York Times.
Hi.
The policy emphasizes greater cooperation with the United States in the Arctic, yet it also repeats Canada's position on the Northwest Passage, which is, of course, contrary to American policy. Do you anticipate that the incoming administration in Washington is going to push Canada on that claim to the passage?